So welcome everyone. I'm Beth Ribet, the Director of Repair and the host of the Civics Project. And I'm very excited to be joined today by Dr. Jeanine Abrams McLean, the Vice President of Fair Count, in order to advance our conversation today about the census. Before we dive into that conversation, I want to just begin with a brief land acknowledgement, which is always a little complicated in virtual space since we know folks are joining us from all over. But we'll go ahead and do that from where Repair is based in Los Angeles. So Repair would like to acknowledge the Gabrielina Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tovangar, the Los Angeles Basin and South Channel Islands. And we are grateful to have the opportunity to work for the Taraha Tum, the indigenous peoples in this place. We pay our respects to Hanukvatam, the ancestors, Ahihiram, the elders, and Eohinkam, our relatives and relations, past, present, and emerging. As noted, I'm delighted to be joined today by Dr. Jeanine Abrams McLean and want to introduce her briefly before we begin our primary conversation. Dr. Jeanine Abrams McLean is a highly skilled researcher with over 15 years of experience designing, managing, and implementing population-based studies and projects. During her tenure at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, she applied her expertise in computational biology and population-based studies to help understand and control the spread of antibiotic resistance. In addition to her research, she has extensive project and personnel management experience, as well as work in community organizing. Jeanine graduated from Duke University with a bachelor's degree in biology and a minor in theater studies. She earned her doctorate in ecology, evolution, and behavior from the University of Texas at Austin. As the daughter of United Methodist ministers, Jeanine was raised to serve her community, and she co-founded and directed a mentorship program for African-American undergraduate students at UT Austin. In addition to her work in public health, she is passionate about finding creative ways to tackle community-based issues using both strategic planning and innovative ideas. She lives in Tucker, Georgia, with her husband and 2 sons. All right, so Dr. Abrams McLean, I want to invite you to unmute. And I want to just begin for our audience, many of whom are not familiar with the nuances of the census, even though we've generally all heard of it, and ask you, can you tell us more about the purpose of the census and the way it works? Why do we have it? Why is it built into our Constitution? How does it function?
Well, thank you so much, Beth, for allowing me to be here today. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. If the folks online are like me, before Fair Count started or was founded by my sister, Stacey Abrams, I knew of the census, I had participated in the census, but I didn't really know why we had to do the census. And of course, starting an organization that is on the census, I had to do a lot of research. But what it boils down to is that the decennial census is a count of everybody in the country and everybody living in the country. So not citizens, but every single person living in the United States. And that count is important for several reasons. One, it is how we divvy up power, so political power. In April, we had the first set of census data from the 2020 census released. And those data were actually used to reapportion Congress. So to say how much representation every state gets for the next 10 years. And if you followed that at all, you'll see that New York actually lost representation. They lost a congressional seat, and it was by one count. The first number I think was 89 people. They missed it by 89 people. But when you really looked at the math, I think it came down to around 26 people. That if they had been counted in another, they would have, you would not have. They may not have lost that seat. And so it's extremely important for political representation for everybody to be counted in the census. The census is also important for redistricting. So after we what's going on at congressional levels, we need to start thinking about how political power is divvied up at more local levels. And so redistricting is actually the redrawing of district lines. So these are for your state legislator or your congressional lines all the way down to school boards. And so that is, and this is a part where communities can actually have a say. And I'm more than happy to talk about that a little. So there's redistricting. But the census, so that's the power part. So the census boils down to money and power. So redistricting and reapportionment, that constitutes the power. The money comes from federal funding. The 2020 census will direct roughly $1.5 trillion every year for the next 10 years communities across this country. $1.5 trillion in federal funding through over 300 different programs, 300 different federal programs. And these programs, if you don't power part, but you really want to make sure that your community has the resources that it needs, this is where the money comes in. And so that money goes towards education. So federal Pell Grants, national school lunch programs, Title I grants to schools, Head Start programs. That funding impacts healthcare, so Medicaid and Medicare, WIC, SNAP, and CHIP, disability assistance. It also impacts infrastructure, so highway planning and construction, environmental protection, disaster recovery. All kinds of things are dependent, including our recovery from the pandemic, right? So the funding that will go to different states to help recover from the pandemic, and as well as, we know last year was a crazy year, especially in the South and out west for extreme weather. Those kinds of that type of recovery will be dependent on the count that we got in 2020 in 2020. And so the census is important because it impacts so many aspects of our lives. And that's why we know, even though the census count has been done, the census technically isn't over yet. We haven't received all the data, but that's why the census is so important for our communities, and why every single person should have been counted. But if you weren't counted, then you make sure you get counted in 2030.
So that was amazing. And I just want to clarify a few things, because you did an incredible job of introducing so much complicated information. So the decennial census, when you say that refers to the census that's taken every 10 years, right?
Every 10 years.
And you defined redistricting for us. So that's where we draw the lines of, sort of which people get to vote for which representative in the House of Representatives. What's reapportionment? You use that term as well.
So real quick, for redistricting, that's how we draw the voting lines. And that is actually, it goes to congressional members. It's how you get voting precincts. It's how you draw the lines for commissioners, your mayors, and your school boards. Reapportionment is actually taking those 435 seats in Congress and divvying them up between all the states. And so if you have a higher population in one state, then you get more representation. And so that's why, and once the count is done, what we see is that states that lost their count as before, and if another state had a higher count, you have to balance that out. And so if one state loses a seat, then another state is going to gain it. Let me get my balance right. So if one state loses one, then the other one gains it. And so that's the reapportionment, but that's at the congressional level, whereas redistricting is drawing the lines from the congressional level all the way down to the local level.
Okay. So what I'm hearing is that the census is important for district lines, which elections we get to vote in. It's important to apportionment and reapportionment, how much representation each state gets in the House of Representatives. It's incredibly important, it sounds like, to funding. So it's really hitting us in a bunch of different ways. So in other words, if, for instance, a state or a county or a city has its population undercounted, it would get less federal money for things like disaster relief or schools. Okay, so we can understand why fair count needs to exist.
Exactly. I'll give you an even more like a localized level. This was a story that I heard from someone at the Census Bureau. And say you're in a community and you're driving around and you see all these kids just hanging out in the streets or in their front yards, but you think, man, I wish that there was a place in this community. These kids should be at a park. You go and you say, hey, I live in this community. I want my kids to be able to go to a park. Well, the laws in the community state that you have to have a certain population or a number of kids before funding is released to build that park. Then even though you can see those kids running around, and I specifically bring this up because young children are some of the most undercounted groups, or one of the most undercounted groups. So you can see all these kids running around, but if they aren't counted in the census, then you don't meet the requirements to even request that type of funding. And so the money follows the numbers, not the need. So if the numbers aren't there, doesn't matter what your need is. If you're not counted, you're not getting the money.
Very powerful to understand. So let's see if we can help our audience get a little bit more about the connection between the census and voting rights. Can you tell, because I see that Fair Count is both involved in the census and voting rights. What else can we understand about how they're connected?
So we think of the census, voting, and redistricting. So this is at Fair Count. We consider the census, voting, and redistricting as the 3 pillars of democracy, right? And so if we want our democracy to survive, people have to have a fair census, fair redistricting, and fair voting. And so the way that this works is, again, when you have the counts for the census determines how the census numbers determine how communities are redistricted. And so when redistricting happens, the whole purpose of redistricting is so that, or the purpose of our democracy is for people to choose elected officials and not the other way around. And if we don't have fair redistricting or the fair drawing of maps, that allows elected officials to choose their constituents. And that's not fair. And when elected officials do this in an unfair way, it's called gerrymandering or unfair maps. And when you have these unfair maps that are gerrymandered, that limits your political power. Because if you draw a map in a way that dilutes my power and I don't have a fair chance to choose my elected officials who are paid and to represent me, then that dilutes my voting power. And so the way we sort of look at it is you get a fair census. And once you get a fair census, then you get fair maps. And once you have fair maps, that's how you get real civic power, real voting power that is based on and needs.
Okay, thank you. And you've already told us a lot about funding. I want to understand more about what it means for the census exactly to be fair. So I think we can all follow the concept of, if you're not counting people, there's some ways that would be unfair, but why is this an issue of equity? What are some of the ways that it can go wrong?
So we know that in the census, historically, and you've mentioned it already, Beth, there are communities or certain populations or certain groups that are not counted accurately, that are not counted fairly. The Census Bureau refers to communities as hard to count. But fair count, we don't really like that term. Hard to count implies that there's something inherently wrong with the communities that aren't counted that makes them harder to count than other communities, when in fact it's the systems that are in place are not designed to count these communities accurately. And so when you think about what the Census Bureau refers to young children, as I mentioned, as hard to count, racial and ethnic minorities, non-English speakers, low-income persons, those that are experiencing homelessness, LGBTQ persons, those with physical and mental disabilities, those who don't live in traditional housing. There's a laundry list of communities that are considered hard to count. I can tell you that from the 2010 census, we know that white homeowners were overcounted and all those groups that I just read were undercounted. And so that is things that we really focused on at Fair Count was how do we make sure that in the 2020 census that these groups that have been historically undercounted in the census, that they actually get a fair count. And so we worked really hard to make sure that people understood that the disadvantage that they were at, and to make sure people understood that they needed to be counted. But we also knew that there were resources that communities that are rural communities are typically harder to count. But guess what? There are also ones where you tend to have people that lack internet access. And for the 2020 census, that was the first time that the census was done primarily online. And so we knew that we had communities of color, we had young children, we had rural communities that were at risk of being undercounted and losing out on their fair share of power and resources for the next decade. And so that's why Fair Count focused on those communities.
So you've already kind of beautifully anticipated my next question, which is to sort of draw out the links between race, racism, and the census, which we know a number of scholars, political scientists, sociologists, legal scholars have pointed to in the United States. Can you share more about race, racism, and the census? What would be the primary messages to racial justice advocates, to populations of color, to Black communities about why this is urgent? And I realize a lot of this you've already indicated. Just want to make sure we get it.
Well, it's urgent because, you know, for the reason that these communities aren't getting have not historically received a fair count. And I do think that this is something, even into 2030, that we're going to have to continue to work on. One of the things that happened in 2020 that no one expected was the pandemic. And the pandemic, if you look at the groups, right, the pandemic disproportionately impacted Black and Brown communities that were already at risk of being undercounted. And then you had a pandemic that, you know, that came along and made, you know, getting an accurate count even harder. And I think that, you know, we have to be, again, there's inherently wrong with any of these groups that have been undercounted. But what needs to happen at both the federal level, the philanthropic level, and at the grassroots level is that we have to work with communities, provide resources for communities so that they are educated about the importance of the census, that they are, you know, in 2030, I pray to God, not starting from the same place that we started in 2020. I want to, you know, this Fair Count's goal is to have a continued about the census. When I talk about redistricting, when I talk about the pandemic, I always bring the census back into it because the census needs to be as, you know, as important to everybody as voting is. It needs to be just as important as a way to claim power. And so over the next decade, we need to make sure that communities are aware, make sure that they are ready to go, make sure that they understand the importance. And then there also need to be changes at the federal level. And I think that philanthropic groups need to provide more funding over the long term to make sure that communities that are at risk undercounted have the education and the resources that are needed to make sure that they get counted.
Amazing. So you were mentioning some of the issues that you were heading into in 2020. What was Fair Count doing on the ground other than, you know, community outreach? Were there interventions that you were making to the federal government to try to address disparities and flaws in counting?
Well, I will talk about one thing that I think that this is relevant for a lot of people in a lot of communities. One of the things I mentioned, access to the internet. So we're anchored in Georgia, but we do national work. But in Georgia, we knew going into the census, again, the 2020 census, the first census that was done primarily online, that at least 20% of Georgia households lacked internet access. We have organizers who live and work in the communities that we work in. And we knew that there were stories about kids that had no access, or communities that didn't have access. The only place that they had access to free Wi-Fi was the local library, and that kids would go out, you know, after school or in the evening, they would go park outside of the library to access the internet so that they could do their homework. Well, this one story that we heard from one of our organizers was that in one of these rural communities, that the library didn't want the kids loitering, right, in their homework because they don't have access to the internet. they didn't want them loitering. And so they started turning the Wi-Fi off earlier in the evening so that no one would come out there. When we heard that story and knowing that these are the communities that need to be counted in the census, and that it's going to, and full disclaimer, you could do the census by paper and over the phone, but it was primarily done online. We just, hey, if the state's not going to bring the internet to everybody, then Fair Count will bring the internet to people where they need it. Prior to the census, before the 2020 census, we installed 150 internet installations across Georgia. So these were internet installations in churches. We actually started in AME churches, did a pilot project in 25 churches. We put them in community centers, barber shops, migrant farm worker clinics, libraries, wherever we could put them. At this point, 160. We're still, and when we did it, we, again, thinking about our goal is long-term power building in these communities. And so we can't be extractive. And so in an effort to not be extractive, we said, hey, we're going to give you all this resource. We're going to pay for it. We're going to give you tablets and, Chromebooks. We're going to give you this because this can be a resource for the community after the census is over, because it's about long-term power building. And when the pandemic hit, those spots, those hot spots were not only useful for the census, but we had one of our pilot churches had over 40 families park outside of the church over a given week, just so that their kids could do their schoolwork when the school for the pandemic. And so these are things that, and we're, like I said, we're still paying for the internet. We're expanding this network to make sure that people have access to this. But this, again, is another issue that state governments and local governments can tackle, and making sure that people have broadband access, not just for the general. And so that's one thing that we were really, really focused on before the census. And one of my favorite projects that we actually did.
That's incredible work. Thank you so much for sharing that. And yes, the fact that Fair Count had to do it because the states and counties weren't stepping up is huge. You mentioned not wanting to be extractive. I just want to make sure that we're understanding what that means in terms of not just taking from communities, like not just getting them counted, but making sure that you're also putting things into the communities.
Definitely.
Right?
One way that we're non-extractive is that we don't, and I'll just tell you, our CEO, Rebecca DeHart, has been in the political realm for a long time. A lot of time, and communities see this, especially campaigns, extractive organizing is hiring somebody from Atlanta to go to South Georgia to get your vote, and then they're gone until the next time you see them. We do deep dive organizing. Some of our organizers have been there in those communities, maintaining and building relationships with those communities since our founding. And so that is what we mean by non-extractive deep dive organizing, to make sure that we hear from the people and use our input from those community members to guide all of our work.
That's beautiful, and a lesson in civic participation itself, not just limited to the census. What should we think of the 2020 census results? Does it appear that it's been taken well? Can you see that it's been unfair? Have people been counted?
We don't know. Say that there are a lot of we haven't received the data yet, so not all of the data. The redistricting data are due by the end of September. Some will be released in August, but we do know, based on the self-response only. So this does not include the door knocking phase, or doesn't include that. But for the self-response phase only, we do know that when you look at majority, and we can't say that this is a white household, this is a Latinx household, this is a Black household. But when we look at census tracts that were primarily Hispanic or Latinx, Black or Native American, that the self-response rates were lower than the self-response rates of census tracts predominantly white. And we also know that some self-response rates in some southern states where that were particular, like Louisiana, particularly hit hard, not only by COVID, but also multiple hurricanes, were lower than other relative to other states. And so we, Fair Count and other groups and researchers and statisticians and advocates from around the country are working, and I know have been working diligently to make sure that the data that come out of the census are as accurate as possible. And so but I can't say what the census data look like because we haven't seen them yet.
Gotcha. So what I'm hearing is that we should be concerned, but we won't know for a little while yet.
I think that we should, we'll see. It was I think we were going into this knowing a tough census general, but no one anticipated an entire pandemic. And so I think we have to take that into account and just look at the data when they come out, but know that folks are working to make sure, especially civil rights groups are working to make sure that we get the best quality data that we possibly can get.
Okay, good. Thank you. So you mentioned the problematic term hard to count. And what I was thinking as I was listening is that maybe what we need to say is that our federal government is bad at counting sometimes. So what changes need to be made in federal policy and practice? We've identified something about what the problem is. If you were up there doing a legislative briefing at the moment, what would you be saying? Like, these are the top 4 things, for instance, that Congress should do. This is what the Secretary of State should do, so forth. And just for our audience's background, we know that the Constitution requires that we take a census every 10 years. And that's been done since the late 1700s. So it's been going on a long time. But the Constitution doesn't set a lot of requirements or detail beyond that. So it's ultimately up to our federal government to make the rules, to set the process. So if you were going to go up there and make some fixes, what would be top of your list? Maybe top 3 or 4?
First, I think that the Census Bureau does do a lot of community partnerships. And I think that those community partnerships should be fostered for the next decade, and that there should be periodic, that we can't, and this goes for everybody. We can't, like I said, we can't just start in 2029 or 2028 getting ready for the 2030 census. To be an ongoing process. I do think that the Census Bureau needs to be a little bit more transparent and to have more planning around natural disasters. Nobody, one of the biggest issues about, or for me personally, about the way that the census went. One, it was highly politicized in 2020 based on the former administration. But there was just all this back and forth, and it's extended, and now it's ending, and there was a lot of confusion. There was also not as much transparency as I think there should have been around different operations. That's one thing I'd call for, a little transparency, especially about contingency plans. And then I think the last thing would be one of the ways that the Census Bureau divvies up their workers. And it is, and I say this, the Census Bureau and the staff, like the lifetime staff at the Census Bureau, are amazing. These are people that, and I used to work for the government, so I know it's hard when the outward facing government part makes it look like, everything's crazy. The people that are really working, every single day to try and make sure that they meet their goals. But one thing that the Census Bureau does is that they have area census offices. And these area census offices are places where you actually have their physical places, and they cover a certain geographic area. And they're typically done, my understanding is that they're done based off of population size. And so if you're in a big city, you might have 2 or 3 area census, or a metropolitan area, you might have 2 or 3, area census offices. But I think the Census Bureau has to take geography into account. In Georgia, even though Georgia ended up we surpassed our 2010 response rate. We were one of only, I think, 3 southern states that was able to do that. But at one point, we had the lowest performing area census office in the entire country. There was a map, and that one had to be a different color than all the other ones on the map because it was low performing. But the problem with that one was that one census office was responsible for about 6 counties in South Georgia. And so when you out, how do you have one office cover 60 counties, even if the populations are small? You can't cover that entire geography with a single office. And so this is actually something I said to, so I don't feel bad about it. I think they need to rethink how they really focus on those area census offices to make sure that in 2030 that we can get help to and assistance to especially rural communities with smaller populations, but a lot of land.
Mm-hmm.
That was very specific, but I think it's a big deal.
No, I think that's a fantastic example of what we need to be thinking of. So what should we be doing beyond the census? I mean, we understand the practical ways in terms of how our government works, that the census is tied into voting, to representation, to funding. But we also look to it, researchers around the country look to it as a source of information about the US population. You know, as somebody who has a great deal of background in policy and has been thinking hard about the politics of counting, are there, areas of research that you think the federal government needs to be deepening with or within or outside the census? What haven't we been counting besides populations that have been ignored? If you were to project.
So we actually have a program right now, or a report right now, called Pandemic to Prosperity South. And I think, which really looks at I think a couple dozen indicators that, and it specifically looks at the South, but there's also a larger national pandemic to prosperity, and that you just got it in the chat. But one of the indicators that I think that we don't currently have enough information about is, how the pandemic's impact on kids. And if y'all probably just heard somebody asking me something, that was my 5-year-old who was asking me about a toy. If he could, yes, you can have it. See, I don't even know if I should have done that, but I just answered. But yeah, so this is my 5-year-old who's going to kindergarten next year. But we don't have, there is some data. We don't have a really, accurate picture of how the pandemic is impacting students. Again, going back to students that missed out on a year of school, that are missing from school because either they're having to stay home and take care of their siblings while their parents go to work, or they don't have internet access. But basically really looking at what is the impact of this pandemic on school children. My family was blessed enough and privileged enough for both my husband and I work from home, and we were able, and my son, my 9-year-old was able to do 3rd grade online, and we were able to homeschool our 5-year-old for pre-K. But there are just so many other families and children out there, particularly children of color and rural and children living in rural areas that did not have this, weren't able to do this. And so I think the government really needs to, and I'm also a former high school teacher, so this is near and dear to me. I think the government really needs to take a look at the impact of the pandemic on children. And then the second thing that I'll mention is prison gerrymandering. So prison, so prison gerrymandering is a practice. Again, gerrymandering is the unfair drawing of maps. And so prison gerrymandering is a practice that is done where prisoners are counted where they are incarcerated and not where they are from. And what ends up happening is communities that have these jails and these prisons, they count those which typically are in more white rural areas, these communities are able to count the prisoners as a part of their population. And so they actually get more power and money because they count the prisoners, whether they're incarcerated for 3 days or 30 years, they get counted at that prison. And so and there are some jurisdictions, some state legislators, I think Hansi Lo Wang had an article about prison gerrymandering where he highlighted a district where it was, I think the jail made up over 90% of this legislator's constituents. And that makes absolutely no sense. It's money that's being taken away from communities. And let's just be honest, where most people that are incarcerated are Black and brown. And so you have money away from those communities and shifted over to the communities where these jails are. And there's a program called, an organization called the Prison Policy Institute that is really on prison gerrymandering. You can go to prisonersofthecensus.org and learn more about it. And they're working with states to change the prison gerrymandering rules. I think at this point, there are about 8 to 10 states that have actually decided to not practice prison gerrymandering. But I think it needs to be something done at a much higher level, and it should just be the practice should just be done away with. So those are my top 2. Take care of the babies, see what's going on with the babies, and let's get rid of prison gerrymandering.
Fantastic. I would love to hear more just about what Fair Count is turning its focus to now, and also just what's happening for you all in Georgia. What's on the ground? Oh, I think we might have just lost Dr. Abrams McLean. Yep, let's give her a moment to log back in. Those watching the recording, we're going to pause it. We'll be back in a moment. No problem. So we've resumed recording. Welcome back, Dr. Abrams.
Sorry about that.
Not at all. Technology happens. We all get it. It's a pandemic still.
That was my apologies.
It happens. Just thank you for rejoining us. So we were asking what's happening on the ground in Georgia. What are things like there right now, and what is Fair Count working on now?
So as I said, Fair Count, we are committed to long-term power building. And that's through civic engagement. So every iteration, the census, voting, and redistricting. But we also, at the core of everything we do, we have a deep commitment to equity. That's equity in power, equity in resources, equity in information. And so we found in Georgia, Georgia has, even though we have the CDC in our backyard, I know because I used to work there, Georgia has consistently been at the bottom of the pack for vaccinations, for COVID vaccinations. And so in Georgia, in South Georgia, there was a mass vaccination site in Albany that was opened that had the capacity to do, to give out, 1,100 shots a day. And, but they weren't getting anybody, there was low turnout. Instead of the government, the state government, putting more resources into where they could get vaccinated, how they could get vaccinated, it was really complicated. You had to have internet access, you had to have an email, you had to have a QR code that you took with you. And if you don't even have the internet, I told my parents and they were like, what's a QR code, right? And so it's just very confusing. But instead of putting more resources into helping people get vaccinated, the state government started moving the vaccines away from that mass vaccination site back into metropolitan areas. And so we partnered, it didn't make any sense. And so we partnered with our sister organization, the Southern Economic Advancement Project, or SEEP. We partnered with SEEP to start our Count Me In campaign. And this is a campaign that tries to simplify the process as much as possible. We have a website that tells people the 3 ways that they can get vaccinated, and gives them other information about, we try and combat misinformation about the vaccine. But we also understand that's a website. If people don't have internet, how are they going to get to it? And so we have our field team. Our organizers have been on the ground since March. They've distributed, over 10,000 door hangers with information about how to get vaccinated. They've made hundreds of thousands of telephone calls to talk to people, to direct them to phone numbers where they can make appointments. And they've also sent out hundreds of thousands of text messages to, telling people about how they can get vaccinated. Because at the end of the day, we want to make sure that people not only have equitable access to the vaccines themselves, but also equitable access to information. Because there is a narrative out there, especially for communities of color, that there's vaccine hesitancy for this reason or that reason. And we're not saying that vaccine hesitancy isn't real. What we are saying is that there are other issues that are greater drivers of why people aren't getting vaccinated. And we've done polling to see why. Some of it is transportation. Some of it is just not knowing where. And so, and you're probably saying, all right, well, I get that she used to work at the CDC, but why would FairCount do this? A straight line from the same communities that are undercounted in the census, that are disenfranchised when it comes to the vote, that have their communities broken up during redistricting. We can draw a straight line from them to the same communities that are being underserved and under-resourced during this pandemic. And so that is why we are doing this work now. And so in Georgia, that's probably, in addition to the suppressive laws that have been passed that everybody's aware of, that is what we're focusing on right now. And we're actually getting ready to move pretty quickly, or we're already in redistricting. And so we're a part of a national hub called Charge, which is about 9 organizations that are focused on building community and through the redistricting process. And so we've done trainings. We're getting ready to do some more, I think, starting next month or in July. And really showing people, communities, how they can be involved in the redistricting process to make sure that their communities get the their fair share of power.
Wow. So
that was a lot.
No, that was fantastic. So we have a question in the chat, but before we get to those, I wanted to ask, what do you need from people listening around the country? It doesn't have to be in Georgia. How do people help? How do people support? What advice do you have to organizers on the ground? How can Fair Counts work be supported? How do people use the information you've shared today?
Well, one, the main thing I think you can do right now is to, and I think Jason put it in the chat about redistricting. I want you, you need to understand the importance of community engagement in the redistricting process. This is how we get power to the people. And it's, we get it through our vote, but we also get it by making sure that communities, you have power. You get to decide what your community should look like and where those lines should be drawn. If your community includes the church or the community's, the rec center that's across the street where one of the lines is, and you're like, hey, that's a resource that everybody uses. That's where we go, when we need help. That's, that's where our kids go to get tutoring for classes. If that's a part of your community, then you can actually say that. You can have a written testimony. You can, there are, apps and digital tools that we're using like Representable that will actually let you outline what your community looks like. And that can be used in the event that there is particularly racial gerrymandering. Those can be used as testimonies in the event that litigation is needed. And so I would just encourage everybody to go learn a little bit about redistricting in your community, and to be an advocate for community engagement.
Fantastic.
If you want to get involved, this is my child again with a toy. Sorry, if you want to get involved with Fair Count, you can go to faircount.org, and you can, we have sign up, volunteer signups. If you want to learn more, you can email us info@faircount.org. But we're always looking for people. We will put you to work wherever we can. And yeah, that's how you get in touch with us. And I think Jason put all of it in the chat.
And do you accept volunteers from outside Georgia? Can people help from wherever?
Yes, because we do a ton of text messaging. And so even for obviously for the census and voting, we'll be doing the same thing for redistricting, as well as our work of COVID vaccines.
Fantastic. So you mentioned wanting people needing to learn more about redistricting and shared some resources about that. I wanted to ask more broadly for folks who want to learn more about the census or about districting or just about power building. Do you have particular reading recommendations that you'd like to share?
So there's one book behind me, and it has a bad name, but it's one of my favorite ones to say. But this is a book about redistricting and about gerrymandering by David Daly. Can I say a bad word on here?
You can say a bad word.
It's called Rat Fucked. And there's a whole chapter about why it's named that. It is about redistricting, and particularly how gerrymandering has impacted our elections in our communities for the past decade. So this is by David Daly. And then if you want to learn more about the census and why the census, how it impacts our power and how it shapes our communities. I know this woman, I've known her for 39 years. It's my sister, Stacy. Book, Our Time Is Now. If you go to 7, there's an entire chapter about why the census is so important and why people need to, and how it impacts our democracy. So those are my two homework assignments for everybody.
Fantastic. So a couple of our audience members, Sharon and Eric, had a question, which is, if undocumented immigrants and prisoners are counted in the census, what is the impact of that, since they're then often not allowed to vote? I know states vary on whether incarcerated persons can vote, but most don't allow it, and many don't allow people who are on parole to vote either. So we're counting people, but we don't let them vote. What would you say about that?
Those numbers, they're still important because, again, it's about power and it's about resources. And so those people that are living here, whether they're documented or not, there are resources for them. There are federal resources that can be used. And so if they're not counted in your community, then those are, that's fewer resources that come to your community. And so I think that it's very important that in the census, again, the census does not say count people that vote, count people that are citizens. The census is a tally of every single person living in this country. And so, every single person counts.
Fantastic. Any last thoughts you'd like to share with our audience today, Dr. Abrams McLean?
I hope everybody's getting vaccinated. And if you have any questions, my whole thing is, I know that people have different reasons for getting vaccinated or not getting vaccinated, but as a scientist, as a researcher, as a parent and a sister and brother, or I'm not a brother, but as a parent and a sister and a daughter, I when you make your decision, it needs to be an informed decision. And, the work that we're doing at Fair Count, we are not forcing the vaccine on anybody, but we're making sure that people have information to make informed decisions for their health and the health of their families. And so if anyone out here is hesitant, I encourage you to learn more about the vaccines. There's this wonderful source that you can find. You can find the first video on our page, but it's done by the Kaiser Family Foundation and I forgot, the Black Coalition Against COVID. And it's called The Conversation. And this is over 50 videos. Not the first one's 5 minutes, but most of them are about 1 to 2 minutes, about 50 videos that answer all kinds of questions. Is there a microchip? Will it make me sterile? All these questions about how the vaccines were developed. And so that, and maybe Jason, if you could put that in the chat about the conversation. And they also just did a new set that were these questions in Spanish. And so you can go and learn more about and there's no harm in asking a question. And whatever your choice is about the vaccine, just make sure that it is informed with real information and not misinformation.
So we're going to be really excited to get all the wonderful things that you've shared today, all the important information out to our larger podcast listening audience. I'll encourage folks to visit www.faircount.org to learn more about Dr. Jeanine Abrams McLean's work and the amazing team that she has around her. I want to thank everybody in our Zoom audience for turning out today, and you're welcome to rejoin us next week for our episode on family and medical leave. And after that, we'll be taking a brief hiatus, but we will be back in July. So thanks so much for everybody for turning out today. Dr. Abrams McLean, I'm just deeply grateful for the work that you're doing, for the energy and clarity that you're bringing to it, for the care that you're clearly pouring into the communities that you're working with. So thank you. And thank you for coming to share your wisdom on a Sunday, on Memorial Day weekend. All of that is really, really deeply appreciated. So thanks to you and the team at Fair Count. We hope to have you visit again.
And thank you, Beth, for this wonderful conversation. And so sorry that I kicked my power cord.
After more than a year in the pandemic, we are all so used to technical interruptions. So we will end our recording, and our podcast listening audience again can find more about you at faircount.org. And thank you again.